Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry about the little technology glitch, but it looks like we got it figured out, so we're in business.
Way to go.
Yeah, way to go. I want to tell you up front that I think of the homily as an integrating moment. And those of you who have been preaching for a number of years will know that that's true. We have to bring all of ourselves and who we are, what we know, all to the table when we start preaching. And till the day we die, there is going to be us up at this ambo preaching the word, preaching how we've received the word, and preaching how the hearers are receiving that word as well. Just as a point of theological reference here, when Bernard Lonergan began to initiate his method in theology, it was homiletics and communication that he had last, right? So that all of the 8 functional specialties in the end wound up in communication, so that all these things began to be drawn in together. For my purposes, though, I want us to begin to think about the closing. This is one of the last talks here. To think of this session as a way of bringing together some of the other things that have been brought up at the conferences, particularly the keynote addresses. So I'm going to be alluding occasionally to Father Barron's talk this morning, to Kathy Hilkert's talk yesterday, and I'm hoping also that you'll be able to bring up things that occur to you, obviously, by way of associations. So this is not just a talk about weddings and funerals, it's a way of gathering together a lot of the things that we've been talking about and thinking about in terms of homilies. So think about that in the kind of the broader picture. Lastly, I have to say that I'm just humbled to be in the presence of this group. The collective experience of weddings and homily celebrators in this room, not only people who are practitioners of and has been celebrants over the years, but also people who have been through funerals and been through numerous weddings as simple participants and engagers of those, for those lay people who are in the room as well. So I'm going to rely on the collective wisdom of the group at the end to help to fill out what I am certainly lacking in here. I've been teaching homiletics for 12 years, and teaching other things for altogether 26 years. And I've always thought of the students as being the best teachers of each other and being able to inform each other. So this is a good forum to be able to think of that. So let me move on ahead here. I've entitled this talk, New Directions in Funeral and Wedding Homilies, the Preacher as the Minister of Hospitality in the Kingdom of God. In her chapter entitled Ashes to Ashes, Dust to Dust, How to Turn Your Loved One into Jewelry and Why, Lisa Takeuchi-Cohen details for us a lively tour of the new American way of death. Deceased actor Don Atkinson was cremated and turned into a diamond, courtesy of his adoring wife and a company called Life Gem, which, as of 2006, makes over 100 such diamonds a month. Cullen's book, Remember Me, accounts for a variety of these techno-friendly forget-me-nots in contemporary funeral practices in an attempt to celebrate life. From rendering the deceased fashionably biodegradable to comfortably airtight in a fabulously expensive casket, the eclectic and eccentric funeral practices in American culture have for many years been a mirror of the age of individualism and late capitalism. Diamonds are, after all, forever. All this behavior should not surprise us in a country whose backbone of individualism and nonconformity has maintained itself in a more or less fixed capacity since its foundation. As Ralph Waldo Emerson famously wrote in Self-Reliance, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if he be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world. Emerson's essay, I think, more than hints at what faced the religious community in America over the years. More specifically related to our present topic this afternoon, in my view, is that our way of encountering death, or shall we say, how we dispose of one another, has long ceased to ritualize how societies and communities grieve, but has become a kind of postmodern fragmentation of personal desires, mawkish sentiments, gushing eulogies, and in some cases outlandish and expensive spectacles. In a word, a morbid cafeteria catering to self-reliant tastes. The same mentality prevails, obviously, in a somewhat different outcome, to weddings, in which a traditional ritual celebrating community has become a bevy of competitive and exotic theatrical events held on either Waikiki or Mount Fuji, far from the community which raised the couple. The religious faith tradition of many different beliefs may well ask, how is a community that celebrates common gratitude for the life of the deceased one engaged? Or again, how does a community ritualize the rite of passage from single life into the union of two selves? Here, I want to bring up what Father Barron was talking about this morning, because we are running smack dab into exactly what he was saying and how he described this culture of the disenchanted world, chasing after eccentric practices for grieving because there is a kind of restlessness that could be more or could be satisfied, provocatively so, in terms of funeral. So we're throwing into our infinite caverns, as Father described it, expressions of grief, one of which competes with the other, facing a competing God. So in a sense, our last will and testament is really our last will of fighting against this God who's competing with us. Subjective relativism, my will, that is to say, is literally my last will and testament, and it determines the value or the last word that I'm going to have. Submitting myself really to a kind of objective rite or objective ritual in the church means participating in the end into God's sovereignty, allowing your body to be embraced by this God, this, as he's referred to over and over again in the New Translation of the Roman Missal, His Majesty, is incomprehensible to a society that relies on self-reliance and that thinks of itself as its own self-reliant subject. So funerals decline over and over again and are replaced by personal taste, that is to say, what Father brought up this morning, as a series of kitsch expressions, literally so. On a more personal note, I hear from my priest friends over and over again that the baby boomers of the kind of my generation are refusing to allow their parents, who have been lifelong Catholics, any kind of funeral rite. Father, just come down and say something at the parlor. And nothing much by way of, because they're through with religion, or religion somehow doesn't speak to them, so they would have to confront this objective reality called the church, its values, and the God that's disclosed there. And that means trouble. So on that, in that regard, I think we're also seeing a kind of generational unfolding. And it's particularly sad, as I tell the deacons that I have in class when we go through this funeral teaching and wedding teaching, that these people who are now in their 70s and 80s, and in some cases 90s, are the ones who built the infrastructure of this church in America. And it is so sad that the very people that built the schools, that built the churches, that contributed financially to its well-being, are now being denied the very thing that they themselves have submitted themselves to over the years. So it's really a tragic situation in my estimation. The religious struggle in the homily is magnified, of course, in the larger cultural context. Preachers come with the Word of God and a rich liturgical language grounded in historical memory to speak a word to those who have lost collective memory and that which has become, over the years, for the religiously inclined, the backbone of scriptural tradition. To put this another way is to remind ourselves of what French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard's celebrated expression has meant. We have lost a sense of meta-narrative or a grand narrative guiding culture, but live episodically in a series of micro-narratives. And again, exactly what Father Barron was saying this morning in terms of how people make judgments on a very subjective level, sitting around or floating around in their tubes. And for the Judeo-Christian tradition, this means a kind of collective amnesia of salvation history and a collapse into a narcissistic, personal, and idiosyncratic eruption of the compulsive self. How is the Catholic preacher at funerals and weddings to become what Fulfilled in Your Hearing calls the mediator of meaning? How do we preach Christ crucified if we have very few common foundational symbols or gestures which speaks of grieving, loss, unity, and regeneration? We are far from the world of the book of Genesis, which talks about grieving for Joseph's father Jacob 70 days in Egypt. And this is Egypt, which was not part of Israel, of course. Personal funeral rites and marriage practices are the only alternative to a culture which acknowledges nothing except the sovereignty of the self. Along these lines, I am suggesting for the remainder of this paper that those who preach might do well to investigate Chapter 53 in the Rule of St. Benedict on the reception of guests, which showcases hospitality as a foundational and cross-cultural symbol. I underline the word foundational because I believe that hospitality forms a necessary anthropological and theological response to a fragmented world of subjectivity and relativism. So I'm not talking about warm fuzzies here. I'm talking about the preacher revealing to the culture the God who is the ground of all being, and as such is the grand host of who we are. In a sense, I'm introducing, or better yet, echoing a sociological category discussed by Redemptorist James Wallace in his fine book, available out here, Preaching to the Hungers of the Heart, where he suggests that there are essential hungers to find meaning, to find belonging, and to find wholeness, which preaching answers in a fundamental way. I want to claim that in an alienated society bereft of what many would call home, we seek shelter under God's protective care and the hospitality of the kingdom. Preaching is the mustard seed sown in the field of the Lord, which happens to be the 21st century. It is here that the birds of the air come and build their nest of every kind, a visible sign of the kingdom. I'm reminded here of Kathy Hilkert's crucial observation yesterday concerning the preacher as an embodiment of the Scriptures whereby God enters into dialogue with us. So here's a sense in which what I'm suggesting is an opportunity to preach a graced invitation through the revelation of hospitality. Not only the baptized, of course, but the unchurched, the hostile, that also will be present at these funeral and wedding rites. By exploring the role of hospitality in the scriptural funeral and wedding text, we might consider what I'm calling the preacher as minister of hospitality in the kingdom of God, after briefly investigating the role hospitality places in funerals and weddings. I will follow each section with a video segment of a homily preached by one of my students as a transitional deacon at St. Meinrad School of Theology and Seminary. At the end of the entire presentation, I have some questions that I'm going to pass out for kind of a collective engagement on this issue. Preaching funerals. In the April 9th issue of Newsweek, Andrew Sullivan recommends that we jettison the jejune world of church and its politics and reduce life to the essential Jesus, modeled after someone like St. Francis. Sullivan, who is a thoughtful cultural critic and in many ways raises some very intelligent issues in this article, might better ponder the role of the faith community in the life of Jesus and Francis. That humanity, taken, blessed, broken, and given, is an integral part of the world of Christ is without question. Go out to all the earth and preach the gospel to all creation. That humanity also discloses God's presence even in its imperfections. And that is the mystery of grace, a fine point that Sullivan seems to have excised from his Bible, together with his mentor, Thomas Jefferson, who evidently, based on some artifacts that we had, practiced a literal cut and paste in his text, where he went in and cut out pieces of things of Jesus he didn't care for. We are a community wounded by sin and alienation. It needs reconciliation. It needs healing. It needs forgiveness. And so Jesus himself brought the individual cures to lepers and the blind, but with that restoration came a transformation of the community into wholeness. That communal healing means reconciliation and forgiveness must be present from the family to the larger church, if Christ is to be witnessed in the world. If, as Sullivan points out, atheism is on the rise, it is the response of the Christian community. The response of the Christian community ought not to be division and polarization and the flight from community, but the ground zero of living together as one body. Forgiving 70 times 7, that is to say, endlessly. Like Thomas the Apostle, we are called to explore the wounds of Christ in a fractured community, not shorn of politics and the smudge and share man's smell, but find in these traces of bloody violence God's mercy, God's compassion, and I hasten to add, the hospitality of the kingdom. Chapter 53 of the Rule of St. Benedict famously begins, all guests who present themselves to be welcomed as Christ, for he himself, all guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ, for he himself will say, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. The reception of omnes supervivientes hospites as a Christological epiphany is rightly considered nothing less than radical hospitality, a welcome of love not only to pilgrims but anyone who presents him or herself at the fragile doors of the monastic enclosure. Indeed, Benedict will lay special emphasis on receiving the poor, since it is in them that Christ is especially visible. All humility should be shown in addressing a guest on arrival or departure. By a bow of the head or a complete prostration of the body, Christ is to be adored because he is indeed welcomed in them. The disclosure of Christ in the stranger as guest, even more peculiar in the eyes of contemporary America, which has all too quickly walled itself up in the isolation of gated communities and luxury automobiles fit only for one. I love the image that Father Bob this morning used about those tubes, floating around the lake. And in a sense, we're talking about tubes, individual tubes and people on them, kind of collecting together and just becoming more and more tubes floating around in that lake. The ho-hum of floating. Fittingly enough, for Benedict, the guest is attended to with the welcome of the Word of God and an accompanying ritual. Listen to this. After the guests have been received, they should be invited to pray. Then the superior or the appointed brother will sit with them. The divine law is read to the guest for his instruction, and after that, every kindness is shown him. The abbot will pour water on the hands of the guests and with the entire community wash their feet. Perhaps passages in scriptures were read to the guests, which they themselves showcase how important hospitality has been to the Judeo-Christian community, such as Abraham receiving the 3 visitors in Genesis, or Jesus' encounter with the woman who washes his feet with her tears and dries them with her hair in Luke 7:36-50, or the early church devoting themselves to breaking bread together in homes in Acts 2. Taken together, these acts of hospitality, which lavishly adore Christ and the guest, are proclamations of God's presence, grace in the world. Hospitality is the silent language that speaks of God living and active among his people. In Benedict's time, a strong period of upheaval and fracture, maybe something like our own, the sign of the kingdom was revealed in the act of love shown to a stranger and a pilgrim on the move. I would now like to suggest for the remainder of this section that these signs of hospitality are still present among us in the celebration of our liturgical rites in the church, and whose signs are mediated by preaching during funerals and weddings. In his consideration of preaching within the sacramental rites of the church, Father Wallace reminds us that Fulfilled in Your Hearing says that effective preaching springs from an awareness of the experiences that touch the lives of the community. Wallace goes on to point out that the preacher must be conscious of the daily experiences of the community that can lead to its recognition of the presence of the living God, or perhaps more common in our age, to questioning whether God is really active and present at all in our world today. Only then is it possible to mediate meaning by bringing together the Christian revelation, especially as it is articulated in the biblical text during the liturgy and events of the world we live in. For Wallace, Christian preaching inside the sacramental rites answers a foundational hunger present in all people, the hunger for meaning. Along these lines, I am suggesting that the sacramental language of hospitality speaks for the hunger for home, for presence, for a way to discover meaning. For pilgrims and strangers who come to the church door waiting to find meaning in grieving the loss of a loved one, the preacher, as minister of the kingdom, will help those gathered, as Mary Catherine Hilkert puts it, to name grace, because it is precisely an invitation to welcome. Consider, if you will, the ritual action of hospitality already present in the order of funerals. Since the church is a place where community of faith gathers, the rite puts special emphasis on the reception of the body, and has great significance according to the rite. In the act of receiving the body, the members of the community acknowledge the deceased as one of their own, one who was welcomed in baptism and who holds a place in the assembly. These are signs of radical hospitality, welcoming the deceased, without regard to social status or standing, into the antechamber of the kingdom. With the possible exception of baptism, the funeral liturgy is the only time in which the presider, that is to say the church, answers the door, greeting those gathered at the entrance of the narthex. The broad symbol of the church welcoming back the departed is clear enough, but so is the welcome extended to all those gathered. As the guest of honor, the deceased is washed again in the waters of baptism, clothed again with a white garment. These are the signs of hospitality that the church offers those who have come from the dark night of bereavement and are hungry for hospitality, a divine welcome that is beginning to disclose itself in the generosity of lavish ritual. The presider as host welcomes the guests, his family and friends back into the church with its baptismal font, ambo, and table. There the guests will be consoled by Scripture and fed. At the end, the guest of honor will be put to rest to wait the morning of the resurrection. The funeral liturgy itself and the Scriptures hold the key for the preacher to unlock the treasure of God's hospitality in sacramental rites. The opening prayer outside the Easter season focuses on the God who, quote, "in whom sinners find mercy and the saints find joy. Admit him or her into the joyful company of your saints and raise him her on the last day to rejoice in your presence forever." A mirror of God's hospitality, here is the voice of the church knocking on God's front door, asking for a place of welcome for a brother or a sister to join the others who have gone before. At the prayer of communion, the presider asks that God receive the loved one personally. Into your hands, Father of mercies, we commend our brother or sister in the sure and certain hope that, together with all who have died in Christ, he or she will rise with him on the last day. These are prayers which hope for admittance into God's presence at the last. May the angels lead you into paradise. May the martyrs come to welcome you and take you into the holy city, the new and eternal Jerusalem. The funeral liturgy, then, is a consoling presence of God's hospitality. And in the process, we are communicating something about God. I remember this morning someone mentioned that we've been, over the years, communicating this kind of fussy presence of God. And Father Barron made mention of the whole competitive notion that we seem to get imbued with when discussing and speaking of God. But in this sense, there is no longer a competitive God, because the church is disclosing a God of our very being, drawing the beloved back into himself. When it comes to the scriptures, the church has recommended several texts, of course, all of which you are very familiar with, which might be deployed for preaching funerals. Ideally, the family and friends will be able to partner with the preacher in order to discern which texts begin to speak to them at this time of grief. I will confine myself here to the Gospels and suggest 5 strategies which might be used to uncover the kind of meta-narrative of God's graciousness as revealed in the Word. First, be attentive to the overall place of hospitality as a plot device in the passage. In Luke's account of the raising of the dead man at Nain, or in Mark's representation of the raising of Jairus' daughter, or John's passage on the resurrection of Lazarus, all restore the dead to community, to family, and to home. What are the implications? One of the implications of that, I think, again, relative to the talk this morning, is that there is good news about this restoration, because in the process of submitting ourselves to God's majesty and sovereignty, we are also being restored to the community of love. Second, are there problems or knots in the text which need to be acknowledged, which appear to suggest that God is far from us? John's account of raising Lazarus shows us that Jesus waited before he returned to visit the sick friend who eventually died. Some people wonder about this delay. Does Jesus' hesitation suggest an abandonment of hospitality and welcome? Then again, what provokes Martha's faith response when Jesus does appear? Can this mystery be explored and allowed to be unfold for a grieving congregation who may sense also God's delay? What about the transformation of the characters in the story? Martha corrects Jesus for not being around when her brother died. How is she changed by the end of the story? In a way, Jesus is first welcomed by Martha in her home and near the tomb of her brother, but now Jesus is a new host, welcoming Martha and Lazarus into the threshold of the eternal by a transforming sign. How do we imagine that the disciples changed when Jesus told them about the grain falling to the ground and dying in order to yield much fruit? These changes imply that the characters had to make room in their own homes for God to do something new. What about welcoming God in the presence of the mystery of death? In confronting this text, perhaps the preacher will need to be among the first to make room for the Lord. I really can't emphasize this point enough. Sometimes, when you're doing the funerals, you go on automatic pilot just to get through it. And there's a kind of denial mechanism that kicks in for folks to just cope with the reality of the funeral, especially if it's a very tragic moment. But it is very important, I think, that preachers get in touch with their own sense of what this death is doing to me. What does it remind me of? How have I been affected by a death like this? Did I have a brother who died young around the same time? What about the issues of parental deaths that occur around burying people who are around the same age in the parish? 4, observe carefully what the metaphors and symbols are doing in the passages. Jesus portrays himself in John 14, 1-6 as one who prepares a place for his disciples in his Father's house, which, he says, has many dwelling places. The language of the church speaks of death as a journey home. In the final days of John Paul II, before he died, he said that he was going to the house of the Father, a message that billions of people heard. And here again, the picture of the heavenly home is visualized as a place of welcome, an enormous comfort and source of faith that the Creator will not forsake creation at the last. That is far from a competitive God. Similarly, in John 6:51-58, Jesus reckons himself as a meal for the guests who will live forever. He is the living bread come down from heaven. Can the preacher unpack these symbols as signs of the kingdom present among us? Fifth and last, what is the text asking the assembly to do? The text recommend for funeral or for adults include accounts of the crucifixion. What are we to make from this perspective, from the point of view of the perspective of the assembly? The preacher will need to move the congregation to understand this seminal moment as God's gift to his people, the ultimate act of hospitality in which the incarnation of the living God shared our home and died like us. That moment of seeming defeat, however, becomes an opportunity for faith. The resurrection transforms this dark death into new life. That is the reason we preach Christ crucified. A new door has been opened which was seemingly shut from sin. That is the gracious invitation which awaits the beloved. All of us become guests, welcomed as pilgrims at the monastery door, washed with the blood of the Lamb, and fed at his table. I'm now going to play for you a homily that was preached by who was a deacon up to about 3 weeks ago, Father Aaron Westman, who's a Glen Mary priest now, all of 2 weeks. And I asked them to, as this exercise, to go through the text and look especially at hospitality. Now, of course, we don't want to force this theme if it's not there, but I think he does a good job in terms of just bringing this out under a very difficult circumstance. This is not taped at a funeral itself. It's taped at our lab.
It's a funeral homily based off of John chapter 14. None of us, in our worst nightmare, imagine having to gather in a church at a time like this, for reasons like this. I mean, we imagine that this kind of thing can happen in the movies. We imagine that it happens to other people, but not to us, not in our lives. Fortunately, the pain that we all feel today is proof that this nightmare is real. And just a few days ago, you were holding Sarah in your arms. You were playing with her in the sandbox. You were combing her hair, cooking her food, watching her eat as she got it all over her face. And she was far too cute for you to correct her. She is the center of your universe, your source of love. And now these things have changed greatly for all of us. And, you know, I wish that I had the ability to be able to say that this is somehow going to get easier. But I'm not sure that it necessarily will. I mean, Jesus tells us today that his Father is preparing a place for us all in heaven. And that is all great, and it's supposed to be a source of consolation for us. I mean, it assures us that at least Sarah does have a place that is prepared for her. But we want her here. You want her here to be with us, not there. Here in your arms, here in your presence. So the pain is great. And so I realize that what I'm going to say now is maybe not going to be possible for you all at this very moment. Sometimes the pain, the anger, the sadness can be too great. I want to invite all of us here, if we can, if we are able, to think of Sarah and what she has meant to us. Think of the love that she has caused you in your life. Think of the joy, the tremendous happiness. And now think of the love that you would give anything to give to her right now. As great as that love might be, the love she is feeling right now, even though that we can't be the ones to give it to her, is far more than we could ever possibly imagine. We all have to suffer because she is not here with us. But she is feeling the love of you, Anne. And even more than you can imagine. And she is feeling the love of you, Don. And even more than you could possibly imagine. And as we struggle to move forward this day, and it is going to be a struggle, perhaps with just a little bit of our effort, we could all remember that God is longing that we experience that same gift of love, that same gift of peace. And when we feel that love, that gift to us, we can be assured that Sarah is loving us right back in that beautiful place that God, the Father, has prepared for her. And now she, with God, awaits for us to join her in that same place. For one day, our faith assures us we will see her again.
Good argument for cloning. They're not all like that. Transitioning now to weddings. When it comes to weddings, we have all our anecdotal information about the less than fervent state of the sacramental bond, as well as the fragmentation that is implied with this loss, the fragmentation especially of community. I remember, the whole anecdote about I'd love to do 5 funerals and, give me 5 funerals and 1 wedding or no weddings. Even when I was ordained in '86, it's just been like a long legacy of difficulty. We all have struggled with the mother of the bride at the funeral, at the wedding rehearsals, and all of that sort of stuff. But as much as the contemporary church may despair about the drop in traditional marriage ceremonies, this sociological shift has been occurring for decades with no sign of change or letting up. When researcher Daniel Yankovic asked women in the 1950s to respond why they would get married, one woman replied, "Why do you walk with 2 feet instead of 1?" By the 1960s, though, Elizabeth Duvin found that marriage and parenthood are rarely viewed as necessary, and people who do not choose these roles are no longer considered social deviants. A recent census taken in American households finds that over the last decade there has been an increase of 40% of those who have chosen to cohabitate and not get married in any way, shape, or form. I hasten to add that this is a complex issue. There is probably some strong economic evidence for this movement having to do with the couple's financial issues, together with the shedding of social stigmas attached to those who live together but are unwed. The bottom line may just be a question of relevance. An astonishing large proportion of people are finding marriage simply irrelevant. They are also floating on their tubes with other people who are floating on their tubes on Robert Barron's lake. As more and more folks are being raised in single-parent families, the trend to stay unmarried will probably continue to grow. Paradoxically, a good portion of the population seems to obsess over royalty and celebrity weddings, but they themselves return either to a single dwelling or to cohabitation. Maybe that says something, maybe it doesn't. We might chalk up the sociological trend of the decline of marriage to episodic thinking, subjectivism, or an increase in divorce rates. And these are undoubtedly forces which the Church must reckon in its pastoral approach to marriage. But whatever the multiple factors are that are contributing to the public celebration of two people exchanging lifelong vows together, we can agree that the ritual of marriage and its preaching is not speaking at its full potential to our culture in ways that it could about God's love and hospitality. Although there may be those who find marriage irrelevant, the people of God still yearn for a sign of hospitality in order to find meaning in the world and to offer themselves as a home for one another. Can the church and its preachers provide a language of hospitality for coming together of two desperate selves? Not desperate selves, but disparate selves. A movement from alienation to community where they might as well leave the union simply to living together, sharing a table, a bed, and maybe a litter of few kids. This is the challenge not only of preaching, but indeed the vital sacramental life of the church. The preacher deepens the consciousness of the congregation to the very meaning of the sacrament of marriage unfolding before them, disclosing the sign not unlike Christ himself revealed at the wedding at Cana in John chapter 2. And the Lord becomes the new host at the banquet, transforming old water used for ritual purity into the new wine of the kingdom. The preacher's task at weddings will be to reveal that same new wine of God's hospitality hidden in sacramental exchange, the exchange of vows, where the future husband and wife will become a new home, a new dwelling place for one another, a guest who is welcomed at the threshold of the kingdom. In so doing, this couple becomes a symbol of God's presence abiding in the world, making new what was old. The rite of marriage ultimately discloses the possibility of charity embedded in sacramental language, divine charity. The faithful who witnessed the vows are themselves catechized by this symbol to begin anew, welcoming one another as a congregation into one another's presence as strangers and guests. As with the order of funerals, monastic hospitality provides something of a window into the celebration and preaching of Christian marriage. The procedure for receiving guests in early monastic communities was quite intimate. As I indicated earlier, Benedict calls on the whole community to act as servant to the guest who comes as Christ himself. No longer strangers, the abbot washes the hands of the newcomer, and the whole community together with its pastoral shepherd washes the feet of the pilgrim. I think that we can easily see the connection between this hospitality of service and the theological and sacramental meaning of marriage. If you will permit me a metaphor, briefly, to guide our discussion, I would like to suggest that the preacher presider at weddings is akin to a host, or even what I would describe as a real estate agent, who guides the guest through a new home. One of the most popular shows on television right now, and I don't watch TV at all, but when I do watch TV, I love watching House Hunters International, because you get a glimpse of the excitement of people building a new home and living in that and kind of experiencing the reality of what can be new for them as this host, real estate agent, takes them through. The metaphor becomes especially appropriate when we consider the parallels between the guests entering the cloister and the doorways of a monastery and the entrance of their own home. Both become the threshold of welcome at the entrance of which the preacher stands. The door of this home, imagined by the preacher for the couple, might be opened first to a lavish foyer or a living space. This forms the preparation for marriage. Here we can find an abundance of appointments, as it were, theological expressions, catechesis, and self-understanding. As Kathy Hilkert alluded to yesterday about the dynamic of the Emmaus narrative, Jesus asks, "What's going on with you?" So the preacher is at a distinct advantage in discussing the preparation for the sacrament of marriage before the preaching happens, since its living quarters is a place of dialogue with the rich historical and catechetical tradition of the church. This is an appropriate time to welcome catechesis and tradition into the life of the couple. The couple can be encouraged to welcome this tradition as one would invite a guest into one's home who is bringing gifts. In this space, the preacher might access scripture and liturgical texts which will be used for the wedding, opening them up like a big family album filled with tradition. Some of these texts will provide a rich source of reflection from which the couple will be able to choose. What do these prayers say about the theology of marriage, and how does the couple make sense of that mystery? What about taking the nuptial blessing and parsing out of the various phrases for understanding God's blessing their union? John Michael Jonkus reminded us yesterday that there's wonderful possibilities here in mystagogy and for major and minor euchology. Lord, grant that as they begin to live this sacrament, they may share with each other the gifts of your love and become one heart and mind as witnesses to your presence in their marriage. Help them to create a home together. The preacher could accentuate the creation of a home with a bond of love, that hospitality and making a home is the fruitful playground of friendship and love. Additionally, there may be a team of further conversation partners who share this room with the preacher and who's preparing them for marriage. Other couples who have welcomed them on pre-Cana weekends, for instance. This is the living space, after all, in which a couple also continues to be in dialogue with the preacher, with their own understanding of who they are, what they're bringing, and becoming as baptized Christians, including their struggles and challenges along the way. When the journey into the interior of the home continues, the kitchen is laid out for the preparation of the word, as it were, ready to be consumed. This is certainly a crucial point for the preacher to both hear and to reveal to the couple. Why have they chosen these particular readings? How do they speak to them about the marriage they have seen unfolding in their previous discussions? Collective understanding of the readings can potentially form the spine of the homily for the preacher, who can treat this encounter with the couple as a collaborative hermeneutic, maybe a modified version of what John Mcclure has called roundtable preaching. Needless to say, how the couple understands the readings and God's activity in their lives vis-a-vis these readings is vitally significant in deepening their own awareness of the sacrament as well as those who will witness this rite. Are they open to the different interpretations of the scriptures, the different recipes, as it were, they bring for feasting on the word? I know a priest, and I'm sure many of you have probably done this as well, during the course of his homily, brings in and names the way in which the couple has interpreted the passages that they have chosen. And it's a very, very wonderful way of bringing the couple even further into the rite, but also getting the assembly in on the conversation that's going on between the preacher, the couple, and the congregation, and the scriptures that are unfolding. When the preacher leads the couple to the master bedroom, the bridal chamber, it is here that hospitality is fully unfolded. Husband and wife become self-gift for one another, a new home to dwell in. The exchange of vows is the centerpiece for this room, since it is the final commitment unto death. As Christ becomes the bridegroom for his church, offering himself up as a complete self-gift, so does this couple become wedded to the same surrender of the individual ego into one. This moment is nothing less but consent freely given, with a steadfast hope and trust in the goodness of God and the support of the church and those gathered. This very vulnerability of love bespeaks of our roles as creatures who trust in God's mercy and hospitality to carry out what was begun from the moment of our birth. The whole process of welcoming will undoubtedly put demands on the preacher, since listening to the couple pondering the scripture text together with exegeting the assembly are crucial features to be attended to in the unfolding of the marriage. Getting to know the couple will be obviously important, and a simple generic homily will not be sufficient. The assembly of family and friends will quickly absorb how hospitality has been extended to the couple and to the congregation itself as partners in this act of self-giving love. It is impossible to exaggerate the demonstrative character of the church offering hospitality to the couple who are themselves offering up their lives in mutual self-giving in the community of love. The church will disclose openness, even as God receives them and Christ will dwell in them as his own home throughout the course of their married life. As we might expect, is the battery's going? Okay. Not sure what to do about that. I'll scream louder. As we might expect, As we might expect, the liturgy and the scriptural readings recommend for the wedding homily can be mined with the couple for various insights. The preacher might bear in mind how hospitality runs through these texts. Oh, good? Okay. And use them as guideposts in crafting the preaching event. Indeed, the rite for marriage encourages lavish symbols of welcome as the presider awaits the bridal party to join him in the sanctuary. This union suggests the coming together of separate selves under the welcome of the church, which officiates at the mutual hospitality of husband and wife, which is about to unfold. In some sense, the sanctuary of the church is already symbolizing a home, a foundation where the exchange of vows will be initiated between the couple, the consent where the new husband and wife will take each other into themselves, even as a host takes a new guest into his or her home. The rings speak of the vows which have made a covenant of love, sealing the hospitality of two people together for a lifetime. They are also gifts of mutual hospitality extended to one another. As they move out into the world of others, the couple welcomes strangers as well as friends, their own children as well as those whom society has not nurtured or defended. The readings which can be explored with the couple are numerous, but I'm going to limit myself here once again to the gospel text because of time considerations, and now because of sound considerations. These are also 5. First, be attentive to the passage and how it deals narratively with relationships, and ask the text what this has to say about hospitality. The wedding at Cana obviously represents a seminal moment in Jesus' hospitality. It is the first of the signs, as John points out. We can already sense the need on the part of the couple who will be beneficiaries of God's graciousness. We know from the narrator, this little episode in John's Gospel is going to be the first sign of Jesus' ministry. What does that mean? How does the Lord's presence in this wedding further reveal the sign of God's presence among his people? If the couple chose this passage, why were they drawn to it? Does this text confront the sloth of culture, which does not eagerly welcome one another in haste? Quote Father Barron again this morning. 2, are there problems or knots in the text which need to be acknowledged, which may appear to suggest that God welcomes only some into the kingdom? There are many encouraging texts which might be used for the celebration of a wedding, but the gospel text especially might appear difficult to understand for those in the congregation who are unchurched or distant from the church. The preacher will need to work diligently to evangelize without casting aspersions on those who do not live their life as salt of the earth or have been divorced. Can hospitality form a virtue, a sign of the kingdom, without shaming the congregation? What about the transformation of the characters in the story, and how have they been altered by hospitality? I have often wondered whatever happened to the Pharisee lawyer who came up to Jesus one sunny day and asked the Lord, which of the commandments of the law is greatest? I suspect that he probably did a lot of thinking about priorities, and he was undoubtedly different after his encounter with Jesus. The same transformation might be said of the crowd who were listening to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. We never meet the couple from Cana, but the new wine of the kingdom discloses a transformation through divine hospitality and generosity. If that is the case, then the couple and the assembly also await transformation as well with the hearing of the gospel. That change will involve opening our own doors for conversion. Has the sacramental encounter with Christ made a difference in the community of love? 4. Observe carefully what the metaphors and symbols are doing in the passages, especially what this suggests about sacramental signs. After the Beatitudes, Jesus offers the crowds a further challenge, to be salt of the earth, to be light of the world. He recommends in Matthew 7 that those who put his words into practice will be like a wise man who builds his house on rock. That sturdy house is certainly a fitting metaphor for a couple about to build their own home together. The preacher might help those about to be married understand how they go about preparing a home together with God's help. This particular gospel image of the house allows the preacher on the role. How's that better? This particular gospel image of the house allows the preacher to put on the role of a host and take the couple on the tour of the home. What kind of rooms will they find? How do they picture themselves in this house? How will they both contribute to the building and the dwelling of this house unselfishly? What does this welcome say about the goods of marriage? 5. What is the text asking the assembly to do? The texts used for the marriage liturgy are not only for the couple, but for everybody gathered. What are the invitations which the scriptures extend to all of those present, bidding them to welcome the word? For those who are married, it may be the opportunity to renew their own covenant of love and welcome. For those who are not in a sacramental bond, it may be a chance to see how living out a public and religious sign might be transformative to both them and the world. They could move out, therefore, out of a subjective relativism to understand the God of welcome, the ground of all being. The love of the couple has been demonstrated in this sacramental sign in the same way that Jesus shows his love for his disciples and the church. The process of marriage, as well as its preparation, will invite this new couple to open their doors to God's grace. This is the hospitality required of all of us in baptism, as we see Christ in the stranger, the pilgrim, and in our midst at our table. I'm going to play now the wedding homily that, again, one of the seminarians has done. This fellow was ordained for the Diocese of Lafayette in Indiana a few weeks ago. Anybody here from Lafayette? His name is Father Dominic Pétain.
The heart is the deepest, most intimate part of a person. In a very real way, it is the heart of a person that makes him or her who he or she is. Kind of instinctively understand this. He's got a good heart, we say. Or she's a good person at heart. And even in the contrary, we kind of state the same thing. We'll call someone heartless when they seem to be acting more like a monster than a person. In other words, we recognize that the answer to who a person is to be found in that person's heart. But what exactly is the heart anyway? As we think about it, it probably becomes more and more clear that it really isn't all that simple to describe. That's because what we were talking about when we talk about the heart is that we're talking about something that's multifaceted, that has many different aspects. The reality of the human heart goes far beyond the biological and incorporates the mental, the emotional, the spiritual aspects of the person. And so, when we talk about the human heart, what we are in fact engaging is the great mystery of the human person. That is, the complex mystery of that holy other that we encounter when we encounter another person's heart. And so, as it turns out, we find that having access to another person's heart becomes the greatest privilege in any relationship. And also that giving that access to another person becomes the greatest act of welcoming. It is, in fact, the greatest act of hospitality that one can show to another person. In the reading from the Old Testament we heard today, we heard of God's promise to renew his covenant with the ancient Israelites, and that this renewed covenant would somehow be different than before. This time, God wouldn't just give them a set of external laws to follow, but rather would write his law in their hearts. Now, God's law is love. In fact, love is what God is in his deepest self. Thus, we could say that God's love, that is his law, is his heart. By promising to place his law on the hearts of his people, the Israelites, God was giving them access to his heart, to his deepest self. He promised to welcome them into his heart by sharing it with each of them in theirs. The Israelites, for their part, would return this hospitality by receiving God's law, this gift of himself, into their hearts, thus solidifying this deep familial relationship that the scriptures describe as covenant. Stephen and Margaret have prepared themselves to do something very similar here today. In the marriage that they will enter into here in just a few moments, these two will radically open themselves to each other, promising each other full access to the deepest parts of themselves, their hearts. They believe that this radical welcoming is something that God has called them to, and so they embrace it freely. This welcoming is a model of the welcoming that God called the Israelites to when he promised that he would write his law on their hearts. The covenant that he established, which is the covenant that he established finally and forever through the death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. In the reading from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, we heard his exhortation to rejoice. Rightfully, we recall these words today, for it is a day for great rejoicing as we celebrate this act of radical hospitality between Stephen and Margaret. St. Paul reminds us also, however, of the greater reason for rejoicing. The Lord is near. May our hearts today be opened anew, or perhaps for the first time, to the radical openness of God's heart. That is the great mystery of love that we celebrate here today.
In conclusion, I'd like to say that I've been speaking here about the language of hospitality, God's generous self-gift of communication in Christ and the Paschal mystery. I believe that mining the language of hospitality in word and sacrament through preaching, funerals, and weddings discloses a deep, cross-cultural, multi-generational language which will speak to a contemporary culture hungry for welcome. I emphasize again, this is not a warm fuzzy, but a theological, evangelical necessity. That hospitality, an ever-present sign of the kingdom in the presence of the people of God, provides, in the end, a common, crucial language of meaning and hope for the future. Celebrating and preaching weddings and funerals provide the preacher with the opportunity to evangelize in the midst of what seems like a diaspora. Additionally, this sacramental preaching can provide what is new in the new evangelization. The preacher's fundamental function as a mediator of meaning is also the mediator of memory, God's memory. It is sacrament which provides the language for restoring memory to God's works to the people of God, living in episodic, fragmented exile. As Father Wallace reminds us, as a language event, preaching is one of the integral components of the rite, crucial in bridging the gap between the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the sacrament, between anamnesis and mimesis, between remembering what God has done in the Paschal mystery of Christ and what we are presently engaged in doing as an act of realizing the presence of salvation in our midst. Finally, the community is invited to share in this work of remembering as it is fulfilled in their hearing. I'd like to thank, although they're not here to hear this, the students who participated in this. All of them now are ordained priests as of the last few weeks ago. But I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Virginia Martin and her family who are here, because it is because of them and their generous grant to St. Meinrad that we've been having the success that we've been having with the students, able to create in our seminary curriculum the kind of courses that we have and allow them to be practitioners over and over again with different kinds of technologies. So when you see these preachers come and go throughout, you can say a couple of Hail Marys for the Martin family. Thank you.